my name is Eyob Mabratu. People know me as Joe. I am a recovering codependent and excitaholic, which has been a really fascinating journey in understanding that aspect about me. And today, what I want to share with you guys is I was reading the story of the Good Samaritan, and I know many of us have read that multiple times. And often I always connected, with the guy the business guy, the Good Samaritan who stops by and helps this individual. And as I read it again, I saw it from a different lens. And rather than identifying with the Good Samaritan, I identified with the man lying on the street. And so what I wanted to share is just a perspective on what it looks like to be carried to safety. And I think it's a better story of recovery, because the story of recovery that I had before was completely different. It was a story in which I was the one who played the lead role in my life, and I was the hero. And I'm realizing very quickly that I'm not the hero or the primary character of this amazing life that God has given to us. And what I want to open up with is with an illustration. In summer of 2022, at the height of the BLM, all that unrest that was happening, protests were erupting around the world in response to the killing of George Floyd. But in the middle of all this, in London, England, there was this far-right protester, and he was a white supremacist. But in the midst of protesting, he was injured, and he was being attacked by a mob of people who were obviously opposed him. And what's interesting is that there was a man named Patrick Hutchison, and he was part of the group that was protecting the protesters. And he was a Black guy, and he did something completely unexpected. While others were beating up on this guy, Patrick went down and actually lifted him up and carried him out of danger. He carried his enemy to safety, essentially. And that image went viral. And when reporters asked Patrick why he did what he did, he simply said, "You do what you've got to do." And I realized that story wasn't really about race or politics. It touches something deeper in all of us. And the part is that whether or not you've struggled with addiction or just life itself, or you've had, just challenges, there's something about that picture that hits home. And it's this feeling of being helpless, beat down, and surrounded by people who want nothing to do with you. And I've experienced that in my life when I had my first overdose, where a so-called friend of mine didn't want anything to do with what was happening. So he left me on the steps of Sunnybrook Hospital, essentially to die. I mean, he just didn't want nothing to do. But then something miraculous happened then, because out of nowhere, someone showed up. And I don't know if this is, and I still share the story. And I often say, I'm not sure, if I was having a spiritual experience or someone actually showed up. But I just remember this older white lady coming to me and saying, basically, everything's going to be okay. She didn't come to condemn me or to shout advice, but to carry me. That's really what happened. Was I was carried from the steps into the hospital. And I believe that's grace, because I didn't deserve any grace. What I had experienced was my own doing. And we often think it's the people who think like us or vote like us, believe like us, that will heal the divide that even exists in our world. But it's never that way. It's the people willing to be light in darkness. And the Bible talks about this idea that we're called to be light in the darkest places. And essentially, that's the story of Patrick. But that's also the story of Jesus. And I believe that is the story of recovery. That 2,000 years ago, Jesus told a story about this to a man who was trying to essentially justify himself. That's the story of the Good Samaritan. And the man essentially asked him this one specific question, which is, who is my neighbor? And you probably heard tons of sermons on this title, who is my neighbor? And Jesus responded with what we now call the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he tells the story of a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho on a dangerous road in a bad neighborhood, and he gets jumped. And he gets robbed, beaten, and he's left for dead. And then there's two religious people who walk by, guys that you would think would have helped because that's what they were. They were religious people. You think they would care, but they were too busy, too clean, or too self-righteous, whatever they were. They just made a decision that they weren't going to touch this guy. But then a Samaritan, someone considered the enemy, shows up. And he has every reason to pass by because this is an enemy. But he actually stops. He sees, he doesn't, that's the cool part of the story is he doesn't just stop. He sees what's going on. And I think so many of us, we stop, but we never really see what's actually happening. We don't really identify with the pain because he really identified, and that's empathy. And what he does then is he lifts the man up and carries him and takes him to an inn. And that's the story. And Jesus essentially tells the story to this guy who's trying to justify himself. And he says, now go do likewise. And I think most of us, when we hear that story, and I was raised in the church, and this is what I always thought is, I want to be that Samaritan. I want to help people. And I played that role all the way up to the point where, it almost killed me because I got into all these crazy codependent relationships, trying to rescue everybody and losing myself. But the true story is this, is that we're not the Samaritan. We're not the Good Samaritan. We're the ones left for dead on the side of the road. And how many of us have been, through addiction? It has robbed us, it's beat us, and it's left us bleeding. And often religion just walks away. It doesn't know what to do with you. When I first came back from my addiction in Toronto, and I came back to the Met, actually, my home church, it's really difficult for a lot of people to re-engage with me because they only knew me as the kid who went to Bible school, who was going to become a pastor, who had this amazing calling on his life. And here I come back as this beat up human being. And a lot of people at the church, unfortunately, didn't know what to do with me. And they just kind of walked by. And I remember how hurt I felt and how judged I felt. But the beautiful thing is there's always these amazing people that God calls us that says, no, you're loved. And I had a young adult pastor who literally just carried me. And I think like Patrick, we all need at sometimes to be carried when everybody wants to kind of leave us behind. And that's what Jesus does. He picks us up when we can't move. He carries us when we've, essentially burnt every bridge. I know I've experienced that in this season of my life. You think like, oh man, I burnt every relationship, every bridge. What am I to do? But then Jesus comes away and he says, hey, you know what? I'll pay the cost. I had these, because of the business that I was doing, and I was running an agency, and it cost, these were like 6-figure deals and all kinds of big deals, and all of it went sour. And I found myself having to repaying, refund. And I thought, God, how am I ever going to do this? But as I stepped out and just made my amends, it's interesting what God does. He intervenes and he he does something that is overwhelming. And you're like, wow, God, you're so amazing. That you, even though I failed you, even though I walked away, there you are still wanting to pay the cost. And and that's the cool thing about this whole story, that it's not a story about being a good person. It's a story of grace, and it's God's grace towards us. And and I think if you're honest and I'm honest, we've all been the guy on that side of the road. How many of us have tried to fix ourselves? I've tried it, my goodness, trying to earn it. Oh, that's my favorite one. Like I gotta earn my way. Like I again getting back into religion and trying to take a hold of my recovery and setting these standards that I can't ever really meet. But I'm like, nope, I'm going to fix this and I'm going to show the world. What I don't realize is that's the trap. Because the more I tried, the deeper I sank. But then finally, I kind of go, I can't do this anymore. So then people are able to come alongside to help me and carry me. Not because I deserved it, but because they saw me. Guys like John Ruby, like he saw me, he saw the situation. I sat on the board. He knew me. It isn't the first time either. It's the second time. He just saw through a completely different lens. He saw the addiction that I didn't even see. Because at one point, he was the guy on the street that needed to be carried. And that's the beauty of it all, is that we get to not only be carried by God, and until we learn to be carried, we can't facilitate healing for others. And that's really what this passage really hit me really hard recently, realizing like, wow, like I've been trying to fix myself for so long and trying to earn, God's whatever it is, good pleasure, I guess. But I was making a mess. And the harder that I tried, the worse it got. The further I got from God, because I was getting into pride and I was just trying to prove to God that, hey, I got this. But that's what got me in trouble the first time. It's trying to make a living. It's trying to provide for my family. It's trying. It's my favorite word. I always say, I remember saying this to John 2 years ago now almost. And I'm like, dude, I'm just trying to earn a living. And he looked at me and he's like, well, that's what's killing you. You have to, at some point, resign and say, okay, I can't do this anymore. And that's God's heart for all of us, is to come to that recognition that, A, we can't do it on our own. We need to be carried. B, we all have played the role of those religious leaders, that we all have walked past individuals because we deemed them to be whatever. We've judged them. And we've never, and I see that often, even when I'm driving and I see, a homeless guy or somebody asking for money. And there's not times when I can't help myself, where I go into judgment. But I'm not seeing them. I'm not seeing their pain. I don't understand what's beating them up. And until we see that addiction is really that it's the enemy, and that it's going out there and beating people up and robbing people so much. And so it's not the individual that we get angry with. It's the addiction that's trying to rob people, because it masquerades itself as a solution, and it promises things that we, in the short term anyways, it tells us, oh, this is the way you can soothe your pain. But in the end, it robs us of everything. And it's in that place that we need to be carried away. And so for me, this is the better story of recovery, because my conception of recovery before was I was the hero. I was the central figure and the character. And we know that in the big book, it talks about that. When we play We're not just the director, we're the actor. We're all the characters. Like we run this whole show and we wonder why it's a mess. And so the invitation of recovery is simply this, is that are you willing to actually just stay on the ground and be humble enough to be carried away? Because that's the picture. And we have to remind ourselves that when Jesus is carrying us out, when an individual comes and rescues us or whoever it is, it's Jesus really, because that is what Jesus is saying to this guy, do likewise. He's saying, you really want to know how to love your neighbor? Well, do you love the most unlovable aspects of yourself? And then also by doing that, you learn to love others.